the Apostle Paul, and he's talked about the highs and lows of his life. If you were to stop a moment and think about the highs and lows of your life, you'd quite a stand, wouldn't you? He talked about some amazing experience he had. He talked about something that God had allowed in his life that was greatly disheartening. And the conclusion is found, basically, in this matter, in verse 10, where he says that God had told him that he wasn't going to make life easier for him because when life was hard, God showed his strength through Paul's weakness. In verse 10, he says, therefore, in light of all this, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake, for when I am weak, then am I strong. Thank you for standing. You may be seated. So, Pastor and I went to go visit a friend in the church in the Midwest where I was a few weeks back, several weeks ago. And we walked up to a very typical Midwestern white frame house, clapboard house, walked up the steps of the wood floors, walked inside, wood floor, small but tidy, tidy, small but tidy, well-kept room. And our friend sat kind of in the corner like he was banged up. The reason was because he was banged up. What had happened was he's a professional painter, and he was painting his own tin roof a couple days before the meeting. The pitch of the roof was so steep that when he put the ladder up against the roof, it was the same angle. It didn't ever, there was no break. And he said, I don't even know what happened. He said, one moment I was painting the roof, and a few moments later, a few minutes later actually, I opened my eyes in stupor. I was looking up at the sky. He said, man, the pastor said, well, what did you do? He said, well, I went back up and finished painting the roof, and then I called the doctor. Now that's a man! Now I like that. He said, you know, man, it's just killed me. My ribs are hurting. He said, I've been trying to think which hurts worse. Breaking my ribs. Probably a couple of things I'm mentioning. I don't know what hurt worse, breaking my ribs, or he said, the heart attack I had last year. He said, then again, you know, maybe that kidney stone the year before was even worse. I'm not sure which. And I sat there listening to a guy compare broken ribs and kidney stone and a heart attack, and I thought to myself, dear God, thank you for the problems I got. Because the problems I've got mean I don't have his problems. Now let me ask you a question. I want you to look at this right. I want you to think about this. Let me ask you a question. Would you rather announce God's grace or your success? Now we know the right spiritual answer. I would far rather announce the grace of God in my life. That's fine. That's not what I want to announce. I'm just being honest with you. What I want is not the right thing. I'd far rather tell you, hey, by God's grace, I was just elected the president of the Intergalactic Bible Brothers International Congress. And I don't know if they saw me, but they must have seen something. I'd far rather talk about that than broken ribs, wouldn't you? I'd far rather talk about making the high score on the basketball team than God's grace in my life when I blocked in school. I'd far rather talk about how rich I am, how smart I am, how clever I am, how godly I am, than talk about how good God is when I've had rough times. In verse 1, look there if you would, Paul says, it is not expedient for me, doubtless, to glory. It's not good for me to brag. It's what I want to do. But he says, I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. Visions, what Paul had seen. Revelations, what Paul had heard. And he goes on to talk about a magnificent thing that had happened to him. Basically, Paul had gone to heaven. I believe Paul had died, perhaps when he was stoned and left for dead. But in any event, Paul had gone to heaven. Can you imagine? Now listen, young people, hey, look up this way. Can you imagine testimony time on Sunday night? You know, someone says, well, thank God I got $100 in the mail, and I need money, and God provided. Someone else gets up and says, you know, thank God my daughter was sick and she's having the sniffles, so we prayed that God would heal her. What do you know? She was able to come tonight. And then someone gets up, Paul gets up and says, well, I was in heaven this past week, and God showed me some amazing thing. I would love to tell you. Everything I saw revelations. I had visions. It was amazing. I'd love to tell you about it. guarantee you don't have anything that can even come close to touching that. And Paul says in verse 5, you can look at the end of the verse, he says, I will not brag, I will not glory, but in mine infirmities. Look, most of us have an awful hard time handling promotion. And that's why it doesn't happen. And when it does, it isn't God, it's you. Most of us have a really, really difficult time handling promotion. We do far better when we have the props cut out and we're desperately dependent upon God. And when we're smart, we're savvy, we're young, we're the man, and we give God some little token benefit. Yes, I'm just racing like a great guy that I am. Phooey, phooey, phooey. God doesn't need you, God doesn't need me, and God isn't glorified by that nonsense. Now, you have a remarkable paradox here. You have a paradox, a when-then paradox. Namely, when I am weak, then I am strong. Now I know you don't think that, I don't think that by our nature, but that's what God says. When I am weak, then I am strong. And so I'd like to tell you why you are strongest when you're weak. Now, first of all, let's establish when you're weak. You ever been in a weakened position? Maybe tonight I speak to some dear brother or sister, and you're just going through it. In your family, in your health. This has happened to me. You really think you've got something going? You think you're finally starting to arrive in some area, and all of a sudden you see yourself compared in a new light with a new person or a new set of circumstances, and you realize you still ain't nothing. That is horribly discouraging. I learned a long time ago, if I find a bum low enough, I can make myself feel pretty good. But there's always somebody worse, and there's always somebody far, far, far more gifted and rich and smart than I am. So, when are you low? Well, Paul says in infirmities. Therefore, I take pleasure. Now, just so you know, Paul was not, please listen, Paul was not a killjoy. Paul said, I look well on infirmities. He didn't say, I just love it when I get whacked over that. He said, I look well on infirmities. Why in the world can he say that? Well, we're going to find out in just a moment. But infirmities. The word infirmity just means weakness. It's not one infirmity, it's plural. It's many of them. It's where we get the word infirmary from. The only word worse than hospital is infirmary. I'm talking about an old, outdated, saw your leg off, chew on this bullet while I do it kind of word, infirmary. That's what Paul had. Maybe you find yourself infirm tonight. It means a feebleness of mind or body. You ever feel just feeble of mind? Just think, head, work. It won't happen. Or body, work. And it doesn't happen. Feebleness of mind or body. That's not something you choose, but I'm telling you, it's something that you're far better off having most of the time. It's amazing how vulnerable you can feel when you're weak, isn't it? Paul said that God gave him a thorn in the flesh. I don't know what it was, but it was a weakened state that God did not remove. And the reason we're going to see we have already. You ever, I'm going to be in Arizona in a couple of weeks, not too far from John's parents. You ever got you went to the suburbs, but you don't have to, usually they have. You ever got your foot stuck in a pile of cactus? Well, let me just assure you, it is a memorable experience. There's something I've learned about sticking your big toe in a pile of cactus. Number one, you do not feel great. And number two, you do not look dignified. Now that's just a little splinter. It's amazing when you've got a hangnail or you've got a splinter, how you protect that little injury. I mean, if you're shaking hands, you're kind of protecting your big toe. You're leading with your strong foot. It's amazing how off your balance you become when you are, maybe tonight, that's where you are. Paul said on reproaches. The word means to be overbearing or insulting or hurtful. It's the same word we get our word hubris from. That's a good $10 word. Hubris is just arrogance, but it's a certain kind of arrogance. Hubris is the kind of pride that builds oneself by tearing down somebody else. Have you ever been whacked down to size a couple notches by someone who was trying to build themselves up? Have you ever been guilty of doing the same thing? You might guess that we've probably experienced both. pride, shaming others to glorify self. In chapter 10, verse 12, Paul talks about false teachers who, comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise. Friend, whenever you find yourself comparing yourself and your station in life with someone else, it's never wise. It results in discouragement or arrogance in both our flesh focus and self-dependence. In verse 17 of chapter 10, he says, "But he that glorieth, let him glory in the Lord. For not he that commendeth himself is approved, but whom the Lord commendeth." Maybe tonight, we have got some young people here. How many of you young people go to public school? Do you mind reading? Okay, I think everybody. Maybe you're in a situation at your school, and you've got someone that's trying to wag you down a few notches, trying to build themselves, trying to shame you. And maybe in particular, for the same reason that Paul was, he says, for the Lord's sake. Let me just tell you something, young person. You may not be perfect, and I'm not either. But if you want to do right and you're suffering for it, you can take off. There's a God in heaven that will enable you when you are weak, he is strong. So maybe you're there tonight. Paul said in necessities. It means constraint. That is, you're limited. You have limited resources or limited freedom. Paul knew both. You ever felt just hemmed in? You can't do what you would do if you had money, or time, or smarts, or muscle. Paul said in persecution, in verses 24 and 25 of chapter 11, he talks about being shipwrecked and beaten and stoned and all kinds of persecutions that came for the cause of Christ. Paul encountered distresses. The word means a narrowness of room. When you drive a big monster like I have parked out here in South Florida with all your curves and multi-lanes and basically a general conspiracy to work against people that have large rigs in South Florida, which I'm convinced is discouraging people like me. When that happens, you know what it is to feel hemmed in. It's the idea of being between a rock and a hard place, of having your back to the wall, of being on the edge. And in the last two verses of the previous chapter, Paul gives an example of having your back against a wall, literally, being on the edge, literally, and being between a rock wall and a hard place. Paul had a conspiracy to kill him. And so, instead of leaving with some triumphal exit, he had to sneak out of town over the wall in a basket by some friends who were kind enough to let him down on the wall in a basket. That's not exactly a triumphant experience. It's a humbling experience. And maybe tonight, you find yourself distressed or affirmed or ridiculed, or perhaps you're in need. Look, why would any of that be good? Paul said that I look well on this. I think well of these things. Why would any of this be good? I'll tell you why. Because the Bible says, then am I strong. When I am weak, then am I strong. And that's the reason Paul could look on it as good, because you're strongest when you're weak. Look, friend, as long as you own any strength, that is the strength you will settle for. As long as you own any strength, that is the strength you'll settle for. You know why people go to hell? Because they never come to the end of themselves. They never come to the beginning of God's grace, God's power, because they never come to the end of their strength. They think, I'm pretty good. I'm in church on a Tuesday night. I'm doing the best I can. You know, Paul knew what that was like, because Paul was just like that. Paul tells us in Philippians 3 of his own testimony. And he says, you know, if anybody, verse 4, if anybody had the right to brag about who he was, that was me. And that's what I was doing. He says, I had confidence in myself. Circumcised the 8th day. He was obeying the law of God before he was even old enough to remember. Circumcised the 8th day, not a bad thing, a good thing, a God commanded thing for those people at this time, God's precious people. He says, of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, not just blessed to be a Hebrew, but of a very, in that case, changed over time, but a very noble tribe, the tribe of the first king, The tribe of Benjamin. Now look, friend, already we're in trouble. Because you know what? Most of us here, I don't know, but I suspect most here are Gentiles. So already, if you're trying to get to heaven on your strength, you're in trouble. Because you're Gentile. Paul was. And even if you are Jewish, you could trace your heritage to the tribe of Benjamin if your sweet soul depended on it. Already, you're not as good as Paul was. Paul goes on to say of other things. They were his strength. He said, as touching the law, Pharisee. Hey, let me ask you something. You kept the 10 Commandments. How many times do you have to break God's law to be a lawbreaker, huh? Thou shalt not bear false witness, right? You're doing the best you can, right? You think that's good enough? You think that's enough strength? Is there anybody here honest enough to admit that you're not honest enough? Or would you end up in life with a long string that both of us probably have? The Bible says, honor thy father and thy mother. Now, young person, I'm thrilled you're here. You're young people. There are adults here. You are not right with God in this good day. Maybe you've got gray hair. This is true. But you are not right with God in this good day because you do not honor your parents. You say, well, Brother Weiss, I love my parents. I cherish my parents. Well, if that's true, I thank God for that. But do you think you honor your parents to God's satisfaction? Look, I'm impressed with everybody here because you're kind enough to listen to me. But I'm not God. I'm a sinner. So that doesn't teach anybody, does it? The Bible says, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. You know the scribes of the day were scared to death even like the holy name of God. I dare say they had no reverence for God's name. Just because of what you know. People in this room abuse God's name probably 3 or 4 times just this evening. Now the mandate is not don't cuss like a sailor. The commandment is do not take God's holy name in vain. Because if you do, God says, I will not hold you guiltless. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Jesus said, but I say to you, if a man looks on a woman to lust after her, he had committed adultery with her already in his heart. Murder is a sin of the heart. It's a matter of hatred. Now, you say, well, Brother Rice, good night. I didn't come here to get beaten over the head. I mean, I'm not perfect, all right? Exactly. And if you come to that point, then that's the beginning of hell wrong for you. Because not only are you not perfect, and I'm not either, both of us are sinners, big time, good enough to go to hell. That is, sinner enough to go to hell. The problem with a good sinner, as opposed to a bad sinner, is that a good sinner is just good enough to fool himself into thinking he's okay, and has the strength to get to heaven. It's just bad enough to deserve God's judgment. My friend, Paul came to a place where he said, but what things were gained to me? Philippians chapter 3, verse 7. Those I considered or counted loss on account of or for Christ. Paul came to a point in his life where he said, look, I realized that everything I thought was my strength wasn't going to get me anywhere with God because it wasn't legal tender in heaven. It's like having a million of some currency. It's like having $1 million of Confederate money. I hate to tell you, I've got some friends that are keeping theirs just in case the South will rise again. Well, don't hold your breath. Verse 9, Paul says, I found in him, not having my own righteousness, which is of the law, but that which is through the faith of Christ. Now catch this, the righteousness which is of God by faith. When you trust Christ to save you, it's not your goodness, it is God's, and there's no way that will ever be inferior. Look, a person lives in God's strength when he realizes his weakness for salvation. And as long as you have any strength, that's the strength of self. Look, you will live in your weakness as long as you settle for your strength. Let me say it again. You will live in your weakness as long as you settle for your strength. Can I give you 3 passages for you? Not yet. Let's talk about it together. All right? Now help me out, all right? Who was the wisest man that does be himself? Who was the strongest man to ever live? Samson. All right, Samson. Well, that's very interesting. Someone tell me, In what condition did Samson find himself just before dying? Led by a boy, blind, doing the work of a burro. Now, is that strength, or is that the very epitome of weakness? It's ironic, isn't it? The strongest man that ever lived couldn't even control himself. Couldn't control his passions. Few men have ever been weaker than Samson. Who's the wisest man there? Solomon, all right? Solomon said, "Dear God, give me wisdom to govern your people." Can you think of 10 men who made as big a failure of their families, who made as big a mistake as Solomon did? Now, please don't miss this. Solomon literally had the power because of his wealth and his might and his smart, his wisdom actually, to make decisions on a scale that I never could because I was never smart enough or rich enough to begin with and make. You understand what I'm saying? I can't ruin a nation. I can't ruin a country. I can't ruin a family of several hundred wives. Few men have been more foolish than Solomon, the wisest man that ever lived. By the way, did God answer his prayer? Did God give him wisdom? Here's something interesting. I keep back in mind. God gave Solomon precisely the wisdom he asked for. He asked for wisdom to govern his people. God gave it. I suspect if he had been as attentive of his own family and asked for wisdom for his own family, I'm not trying to be hard on Solomon here, I think God would have given it. You know what failure is? It's succeeding at the wrong thing. Hey, how about this one? Who was the meekest man who has ever lived? At least it could be argued. Who was it? Moses. You know why we know he was? Because he told us. But it's inspired in the Holy Writ, so you know what he really was. I mean, Moses was. Now, let me ask you something. Why did Moses not enter Canaan? What specifically was the instance that kept him back from entering Canaan? Meekness is power under control. There was a day when God said, "Moses, you speak to the rock." And one of the greatest ironies of all time, Moses is frustrated with the children of Israel, and God tells him to speak to the rock, and Moses says, "Must I fetch you water from this rock, you rebels?" And then, whack! And he was the biggest rebel of them all. Sometimes we parents, we think, I just wish the preacher would whack those teenagers over the head and really give them what for. You know what? Some of the biggest rebels I know, parents and grandparents. The reason for teenage rebellion is because parents aren't doing it right, aren't owning up to their responsibility, aren't leading as they should. And friend, you can, but only if you come to it yourself and accept God's strength. So there's something quite interesting about all these men, and that is that all of them fell precisely where they were strong. So I was reading a very bad book by a very rotten man last week. Why do you make a habit of it? I don't know. I did last week. And basically, he is formatting a way to overthrow the way of life that we have in America. And it's very fascinating. One tactic he promotes in order to do this is using America's strength against her. He calls it using jujitsu. You know what jujitsu? I think this is correct. It's using your opponent's strength, his weight, his momentum against himself. It's kind of like you wave the red flag, he comes charging, you step out of the way and say, "Ole!" and trip him on his way over. See? What are you doing? He's a big lug, not too smart. You just take his strength and you work it against him. The devil will do exactly the same thing to you. Can I tell you something? Well, before I tell you, let's just discover it. Again, I'm serious. Right now, I'm going to give you about 20 seconds. I want you to think of your three greatest strengths, right? You're not bragging, you know what they are. Right now, think of your three greatest strengths. Would you? Raise your hand when you've got a couple, would you? Don't be modest. Just raise your hand when you think you've got a greatest strength. Keep them up, keep them up. let's go on. Let you put your hands in. Now, I'd like to ask you to think of your three greatest weaknesses. May I tell you something? Very often, your strengths and your weaknesses are the same list. They're the same list. Why? Because when I am strong, then I'm weak. Why? Because you're trusting your strength, not God's. Friend, the gift is never greater than the giver. Even if what you have is God-given, what God gave will never be greater than the God that gave it. Look, how many of you here are confident people? And I don't mean to embarrass you. How many of you, generally, you consider yourself confident? Raise your hand. I believe that. Okay, good. All right, put your hands down. Let me ask you something. Are you confident? Are you? Are you confident? Okay, well, what's the difference? The difference is whether it's your strength or God's. If it's your strength, it's pride. If it's God's strength, it's confidence. I ask God on a regular basis because I need more confidence that comes from humility. It won't be crushed when I mess up because it's based on someone higher, greater, and bigger than I am, God Himself. How many of you here are determined? Any determined? I hope. Any determined people here? All right, good. You can put your hands down. Let me ask you a question. Are you determined or are you obstinate? You say, well, you're playing word games with me, brother. I said, no, I'm not. They're the same thing. The difference is whether it's God's strength or yours. When I am weak, then I am strong. Let me ask you something. Are you guileless? What's guileless? It means without guile. It means not thinking the worst of everybody. Are you guileless or are you just clueless? Can I tell you something? Being guileless is good. Being clueless is not. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 20, the Bible says, brethren, be not children in understanding. Howbeit in malice be children, but in understanding be men, that is, be grown up. You know, I've talked to people when there are issues where things are being done that are not right. And I've talked to people who are knowingly, willingly ignorant because they do not want to be involved. They do not want to get involved. They do not want to do what's right. And so, oh, hey, I don't know anything. See no evil. Hear no evil. Think no evil. That is not of God. So are you guileless or are you clueless? Are you discerning? God give us discerning people. One of the things I ask for myself and for my friends at the Little Ice Ranch is, God, help us to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. It is incredibly difficult to do both. In fact, it's impossible. That's why I'm asking God to help us. Are you discerning or are you just critical? You know, some people, God has given me the gift of discernment so you can come to church and you can slice and dice the pastor's message from now until next Monday. And you can critique about the carpet, talk about problems in front of your kids. I'm not trying to be hard. I've been straightforward. I'm here to tell you, you do that, you will answer for your kids. I was in a church several years ago, good church, numerous times, but there was just a general lack of disregard, disrespect from the teenagers to the preacher. That didn't hurt my feelings, but I didn't know it. That was Saturday night at a youth meeting. Sunday morning, guess what? I wasn't preaching to teenagers, I was preaching to their parents and grandparents. Nobody discovered it. The exact same attitude of those adults towards their pastor. Later that week, the youth pastor told me he confided to me the parents of the church have taken sides with their children against the youth pastor and done so in front of their kids. Now, many of those people, I don't feel harsh towards them, but many of those people lost their kids and don't even know why this was good. You know why? Because, friend, the same God that gave pastor his authority gave yours as well. You know, it goes around and comes up. You can't be a rebel as a parent and expect following from the sweet submissive children. Dad, you can expect to be a rebel and expect to have a right relationship with your mother. You can't have that. So are you discerning or are you critical? Are you patient or are you passive? Here's a kid swinging off the church chandelier, throwing a fit, pitching a fit in Walmart, and Dad thinks he's a patient man. No, sir, you're not patient, you're passive. That is a wicked sin to show up. It already has. Are you patient or are you passive? You say, what's the difference? The difference, friend, is whether you're living in your strength or God's. Are you healthy or are you fleshly? You say, I thank God I'm young and I'm a red-blooded American man. You know, I can't think of a greater temptation than being a red-blooded American man. I am not praying that God will give me a thorn in the flesh. Put me in an invalid's bed. Still what little intelligence I have. Whack me over the head. Humiliate me. I'm not asking for that. But you know why God allowed this thorn in Paul's flesh? He says in verse 7, the last part of that verse, lest I should be exalted above measure. And in verse 9, God tenderly but firmly says, my grace, and I'm so comforted tonight, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made complete, it's made perfect in weakness. And Paul says, if that's true, most gladly, therefore, will I rather boast or brag or glory in my weaknesses. Same word, my infirmities. Why? That the power of Christ may rest upon me. Now, friend, God's strength is made perfect through your weakness. So my question for you tonight, please don't miss this. We'll look this way and ask you very simply tonight. My question for you, teenager, tonight. My question for you, dead man, tonight is this. Are you resting on your strengths, or is Christ's strength resting on you? C.H. Spurgeon said, our weakness is our best argument. Sometimes we think, God, you've got to answer my prayer. I've been really good recently. God, I've been reading my Bible. I've been a real good Christian recently. God, you've got to hear my prayer. You know what? I do not think that God is nearly as apt to answer that prayer as someone comes to God and says, God, I'm so good. God, I need your help. Your greatest appeal, powerful, holy God. It's not your goodness, it's not your strength. Therefore, I take pleasure in my weakness. When I am weak, then I speak. Which is what young people do. Thank you for your kindness. I really appreciate it. Would you just sit up against the back of your seat, young Christian, and there still? Would you just close your eyes? You're looking around. Would you just close your eyes? Young people, thank you for your kind attention. I appreciate it. Let me ask you something. Are you living in your weakness or are you living in God's strength? I wonder if tonight there's one who will say to Christ, I live in my strength, my weakness. I am saying God's weakness, God's weakness. city.